what a CAP survey is. That was the first edition. And we then moved on to planning for success, critical tools and considerations. We're just going to pause for a minute. Erin, we have to make sure that we are recording.
Yep, we're already recording.
Okay, great. All right. So we are recording. Right. So today we're going to be discussing questionnaire design and development. Okay, so let's proceed. I'm just waiting for the slides. Okay, to move down. All right, so let's recap. So what is a CAP survey? A CAP survey entails the assessment of the level of knowledge, the attitudes or beliefs that people have, and the practices or actions that people carry out or conduct with respect to any theme. And so we examine a population's knowledge, attitudes, and practices on a specific theme or topic. Now, in designing a CAP survey, we tend to use structured and standardized questionnaires. And we can adopt various approaches. One approach would be to conduct the survey orally by an interviewer. So the interviewer would tend to read out all of the questions and obtain the response from the respondent using the structured standardized questionnaire. But data can also be conducted partially orally by the interviewer, and then partially by self-reading and self-answering some of the questions by the respondent via a mobile device or also via a paper-based approach. The CAP surveys of recent years tend to use the second approach, depending on the nature of the questions. Questions that tend to have like very personal responses, and where people may feel a little bit intimidated. For example, if you are conducting an HIV/AIDS CAP-related survey, persons or respondents may tend to feel more comfortable answering some of those questions themselves and reading the questions themselves and answering themselves. And you can hand the device over to the person and then move on to the next, have them move on to the next page, and then you can take the device back and proceed with the next question, with a question that may not be as sensitive or personal. All right, so there are different approaches, but we tend to use a structuredized standard approach. All right, so now the specific objectives of this webinar are as follows. We're going to try to understand the critical elements for consideration in CAP survey design. What's the purpose of the survey? How do we engage in analysis? And how do we interact respectfully with communities? How do we get the answers that we want in a respectful manner? In addition, we want to try to understand how we can improve on question content. How do we structure questions? And how do we, well, that doesn't relate to question structure, but how do we word or phrase the questions? And then how do we structure the question sequence? And then we also want to, in this webinar, address the provision of examples of appropriate questions relating to the various thematic components of a CAP survey. So how do we construct appropriate knowledge questions, appropriate attitudes questions, and appropriate and relevant practices questions? We're also going to review common areas of difficulty or challenges that affect the analysis and interpretation. And these can range from, and are not limited to, multiple choice options, dealing with subsets and groups of people, addressing bias and trying to eliminate bias as much as possible, addressing diversity and comparing subsets of people, so comparing demographic groups. So these are the objectives of this webinar, which we hope to explore and kind of achieve a level of specificity to these questions today. So on the CAP roadmap, where are we? Now, we've explored kind of introductory topics in relation to CAP. We've explored what CAP is, and we've talked about, in a broad manner of speaking, preparation for CAP. And now we are trying to ascertain which questions will be best placed within the CAP survey. So we're engaging now in the design of the questions and the development of the questions and the structure of the questionnaire. And so on the roadmap, we haven't listed all of the components of the roadmap, but we're going to kind of look at the first two that are highlighted in red. So we're going to look at defining the survey's purpose, and then we're also going to examine developing your survey, bearing in mind that there are a whole host of components in the CAP development or CAP survey development process, which involve other things like informing the community that we're going to be, undertaking this exercise, preparing with our maps so that we can go into the community with, an appropriate level of knowledge about, regarding where to go, so that we can conduct the survey in an efficient manner, undertaking sampling, training of the personnel, including the enumerators or the persons who are conducting the surveys, and also pre-testing or piloting the survey to elicit feedback so that we can then restructure any questions that persons may not understand during the pilot phase. So, and there are also a whole host, and these are things that you would do before the CAP survey is executed. So we're in the before stages, right? So we're going to focus today on defining the survey's purpose and also in developing our survey. So I'm going to go to the next page, and I'm going to hand it over to Erin, who's going to address the next couple of slides.
Hi, this is Erin. So the first thing that we're going to really get into depth in is the critical elements of questionnaire design. And the very first one is defining the survey's purpose. What I wanted to emphasize here is that when I say define the purpose of the CAP, I don't mean to define the purpose of your project. So it's not your project objectives, it's not your indicators from your project, but it's why you're doing a CAP. And I have an example in the next slide of how that might be defined. But it's important as you ask each question and you develop each question to determine whether that speaks to the purpose of your CAP. And that helps you narrow down the types of questions that you're going to ask. The next one is respecting the community. Every time you send out someone to do a survey, they are representing your Red Cross National Society. So if the survey is too long, a community member is going to think you're wasting their time. If questions get very personal or they're seen as really invasive, that's going to reflect on your Red Cross National Society. And if you start adding questions to your survey that you're just really asking out of interest, but you have no actual intention of addressing through your project or the work that your National Society does, it will probably feel to people as if you were asking them quite exploitative questions. They're giving you their time and they're giving you their personal information and opinions. And so if you don't provide anything in return, that's going to reflect very poorly on your National Society. So you have to look at the questions, each question that you ask, and say, is this really necessary and will I use it? And then the last point, and it's one that always gets missed, is that you have to think about the analysis that you're going to do. So every question that you ask, you have to think, how am I going to analyze this? It's a huge time investment to do analysis. People think that it will take a short amount of time, or they don't necessarily consider that there's going to be a difficulty comparing different groups, or that it's not as simple as plugging it into Excel or hiring a consultant. You have to think with each question that you ask, what is the data that I'm going to get back from this and what is it going to say? So here I have an example of a purpose statement. This is a purpose statement that I made up. There is no Carleton KAP survey. But what I've got here is the Carleton KAP survey will investigate how people understand climate change, which is kind of looking at knowledge and attitudes, and the ways in which they can protect themselves and their communities, which looks towards practices, from the risks that they face as a result of climate change. And then it tells you what the Red Cross is going to do with it. So we are going to use the data to understand what information the community is missing. So you're not doing a KAP just to tick a box. You're trying to find out what doesn't the community know that we can tell them. So what they're missing about climate change, as well as what might motivate them to change their behavior. Because you would have remembered, hopefully from the first webinar, we talked a little bit about behavior change and how we're doing a KAP to figure out how we can start changing people's behaviors so that they can increase their resilience and therefore reduce their risk to different threats, whether they be health threats, climate change threats, disaster threats. Then it says, once we have the results, we will actively seek to adjust our plans and risk communication strategies to encourage behavior change. And I think that's important for the Red Cross to be accountable. You don't just do the survey to tick the box and move on, but you're saying we're going to get these results, and because of what the results tell us, we're going to change our plans appropriately. You don't have to change them if they're already great, but you change the plans according to what you find out from the KAP. And then who are you going to share it with? So you share the KAP results with the Ministry of Health, community leaders, and use them to generate more discussions with the Carleton community about climate change. So not just your stakeholders, which I made up the Ministry of Health here for climate change, which is probably a weird group to share with, but you're definitely going to share those results back with the community, because as I said before, they're giving you their time, and so you owe it to them to tell them what they've given you and what they've said, and to confirm whether what they said was correct, or they can say, no, this isn't correct. We think something else, and you get another opinion. I'm going to pass back to Alicia now. Alicia, I think you are still muted.
Okay, so can you hear me now? Okay, great. All right, let me know if the volume is okay. All right. So let's move on to the structure of a KAP survey. Now, it's not a good practice to go straight into asking the questions. You want to begin with an introduction. Just as you would not walk up to somebody you don't know in anywhere and just start talking without a greeting, you're not going to approach any survey in that manner. So we would advise that you first introduce your organization. You will also refer to the purpose of the survey in the introductory script. And in so doing, it helps to establish accountability and transparency. And first, like I should also say, you should prepare an introductory script and read that out loud. And then another element of the introductory script should be to obtain informed and voluntary consent. So you're not going to buddy into participating. You're also going to address confidentiality and ensure persons that their answers and identity will remain confidential and anonymous. And in so doing, when you meet all of this criteria, it helps to build trust and rapport with the respondents. Okay, so somebody is telling me that the presentation is barely audible. So I just want to confirm that it's a little bit better. I hope it's a little bit better now. Okay. All right. Okay, so somebody's telling me that it's okay, and I'm getting confirmation from other people. All right, so we're going to move on to the next slide. All right, there's a bit of a delay, so we ended up skipping some slides. All right, so we're at the right slide now. So I'm going to read out two introductory scripts, that one of which we prepared, and another was prepared by Johns Hopkins University in collaboration with CADRIM for another KAP survey. So you would want to start off with your basic greeting. Hello, good morning, afternoon, evening. My name is, and I'm working with X Red Cross, whether it's the Barbados Red Cross, the Trinidadian and Tobago Red Cross, or the Jamaica Red Cross. So identify who you are and where you're working and the organization you're working with. So we are conducting a survey to assess the knowledge, attitudes, and practices of communities on responding to and preparing for natural disasters. The survey is being conducted by the Red Cross and the Nature Conservancy. So I just slotted these two agencies in here, but it's just an example to demonstrate to you that it is important to explain to people with whom you are working, the organizations that are most closely connected with this exercise, and what you are doing, what you're using this information for. And we're going to go on to expand on this. So the script continues. The information we collect from you will help us to understand more about how resilient your community is against natural disasters. And we will be asking other people in your community the same questions to understand how we can better equip people with the knowledge and tools to help them to improve their ability to respond and prepare for natural disasters. So I'm going to break here. So we're explaining to people what the information is going to be used for, all right? Because generally people want to know, and that helps in building trust and rapport. It helps to allay people's fears as to how the information will be used. So the script continues. This survey will take approximately 20 minutes to complete. It's not advised, by the way, that a survey takes more than 20 to 25 minutes to complete. But it's important to at least give an estimated time of completion. And then we move on to addressing issues of anonymity and confidentiality. So the script continues. We assure you that your identity will remain anonymous and that your answers will remain confidential. And if you're uncomfortable at any time, you have the option not to respond to the question. Do you consent to be part of this survey? Yes or no? And if no, do not proceed. You end the survey. So it's important to explain to people and help them understand that they're free to participate in the survey, and they're also free to opt out. And they're free to opt out of particular questions, and they're also free to also opt out of the survey altogether, which you don't really want, but you cannot coerce people into doing something that they don't want to do. All right, so that's one example. I'm going to read quickly another example. And this is, okay, so we're finally, okay, there's a bit of a delay on my end. All right, so we're finally at the right page again. So this is the second introductory script, this second example. So hello, my name is A or B. I'm working with the X Red Cross to learn more about disasters and disaster preparedness in your community. I would like to ask you some questions about your family, disaster risk, and disaster preparedness in your home and community. The survey will take about 15 to 20 minutes to complete, and it is anonymous, which means your name and address will not be recorded. If you participate, you can decide not to answer a question or to stop the interview at any time. Do you agree to be interviewed? Yes or no? All right, and this script contains the same structure and the same components that we would have addressed before in terms of obtaining voluntary consent, explaining the purpose of the survey, identifying the agency that you're working for, and so on and so forth. All right, so let's and structure of the questions. So we've developed the introductory script, which is important. And now we're going to address how do we design effective questions. These are just some general broad tips that we decided to highlight now before we proceed to some other aspects of the KAP survey. Now, do we give people an option? Do we give people multiple choice options? I think that's ideal. But do we limit their choices to just one response or multiple responses? I mean, it isn't always realistic to limit people's choices to just one response in a multiple choice question. So allowing respondents to select multiple responses gives respondents the flexibility needed to address questions that can clearly derive multiple actions, practices, or evidence of knowledge. So consider the following. Select from the list below up to 3 actions that you take when preparing for a disaster. In this case, in preparing for a disaster, it might not be realistic to limit their choices to just one option. So we want to give them, more options. The other thing is we don't want to have them select 15. That might not bode well for the analysis of the data. So we also want to establish a good balance between giving them the flexibility to answer in a multiple choice manner, to answer flexibly, but also kind of reining in their responses. So 5 might be a good number in terms of limiting multiple choices. Now, another consideration is whether we allow people to hear the options out loud or whether we require them to answer spontaneously. I think when we're testing knowledge and attitudes and practices, it is often not a good idea when the choices do not reflect standard responses, like, for example, yes, no, don't know. We should avoid reading out the options. So if we are testing knowledge on disaster risk preparedness, we wouldn't want to read all of the options out, because then we are actually prompting the respondents and feeding them information. So we want their answers to be spontaneous. We want it to come from them. We also advise that you keep rankings simple. So, for example, if you use a scale, don't use a scale that has 12 different options. So you would never do this, but highly, 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 and just highly, and then something else, and then all the way down to 10 options or 12 options. Sometimes it's better to use like a 5-scale approach, from excellent to or strongly disagree to strongly agree, with a neutral in between, just so that it, 1, does not present confusion for the respondents, and 2, it allows your data analysis some simplicity in terms of the conduct of that analysis. And the next point that we would want to address would be avoiding and limiting the inclusion of qualitative questions. Qualitative questions are also referred to as open-ended questions. And we've also addressed this later down in the webinar. But qualitative questions are, although an excellent source of data and information from respondents, they can become a little unwieldy in certain environments. And they're generally believed to be more appropriate for informant interviews, focus group sessions, and those kinds of more intimate sessions, rather than a structured KAP survey approach. Be very specific about timelines and time frames. So rather than using words such as recently, identify a specific time period. For example, within the last 3 years, or within the last year, or within the last 6 months. Be specific. Also, be cognizant of the differences between did not answer, don't know, no answer, and not sure, because they're different things, and that will affect your data analysis and the veracity of what you believe to be the responses. Also, following on from that point, provide options for those persons who do not know and who don't have a response, or who prefer not to disclose, particular information. So we're going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so the next tip that we have is to remove the use of jargon. Why? Using jargon may be understood, or jargon-specific terms may be understood by subject matter experts very well. I mean, they work in the field, they're aware of the phrasing, terminology, but the average person on the street may not understand those terms very well. They may never have even heard of those terms. And so you don't want to confuse people. We want to use language that is easily understood by all, because that facilitates the conduct of the survey, whether it's a KAP survey or something else. So one thing that I think can, and that we collectively think that can circumvent or mitigate the use of jargon, is to pilot and field test the questionnaire as widely as possible. And in so doing, the use of jargon and use of terms that may not be well understood should be easily flagged and identified by the persons with whom the survey is tested. Now, the next tip is to keep the need to know, and how do I phrase this? Focus on what you need to know. Discard all of your want to know questions. Don't be a curious cat, and try to remember the purpose of the survey at all times. Don't ask questions that are irrelevant to your survey. Don't ask questions that are exploitative. So for instance, you will hardly need to know about somebody's sexual knowledge or practices when you are conducting a disaster risk survey. And if you do, if you think that they are, very strongly linked, there may be a different setting or environment or type of survey, for example, an informant interview process or a focus group, in which you might want to obtain that information. But focus on the purpose of your survey, and don't get carried away. Refrain from getting carried away by, all of these other questions that you might want to pose but are not necessary. We also think that it's important to minimize the demographic survey data. Although it may be tempting to try to get people demographic data on maybe 15 topics, so their age, their sex, their ethnicity, the way in which they identify sexually or otherwise, we have to ask ourselves, what are the key variables that are critical for the survey, and focus on those. And also consider the appropriateness of the questions, and that follows on from some of the previous points. So refrain from being exploitative, do not ask irrelevant questions, and just stick to the issue at hand. All right, one example may be, if I can highlight, in terms of minimizing the demographic survey data, in persons and respondents seem to get a bit uncomfortable when they're asked about their socioeconomic profile and their salary levels. In some cultures, people can either be very open in disclosing this information. Here in Barbados and in some other countries, we tend to be very private with regard to those types of questions. So think carefully about whether asking persons those types of questions, one, will give you the information that you need to know and serves any real substantive purpose in the survey. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. And we're going to expand on the demographic questions. Now, there are usually about 8 main demographic questions that are considered like the essential questions to ask. But of course, it depends on the purpose of your survey. Now, in KAP surveys, demographic questions have a descriptive purpose. And the questions seek to answer basic information about respondents that allow us to understand the profile of each individual, where they fit into the general population, and in so doing, it allows the researchers and the data analysis experts or officers to then compare groups with one another. So what is generally considered to be essential? Gender, age group, socioeconomic group, education, ethnicity, employment, whether the industry that you work in, what type of job you have. Those are all considered to be some of the top and most popular demographic questions, along with some other questions that we haven't posed here, but I'll read them out to you. Questions relating to your location, of course, because persons in the north of the country or on the coast might react differently or view disaster preparedness differently to somebody who lives inland. So location and geographical placement is also considered to be one of the most used demographic questions. Marital status is another very popular demographic question, right? So those are 2 additional questions that we haven't listed here, but which are very much utilized in many surveys. We don't always need to ask all of these questions. So again, determine the ones that are most suitable to your survey. So you have to approach that on a case-by-case basis. All right, I'm now going to hand over the presentation to Erin. She's going to continue, and then we'll switch later.
Hello again, this is Erin. So we're going to talk about knowledge questions now. And so in the first week, we talked a bit about what we would get out of knowledge. And so we have a basic understanding of that. And we went through the different types of questions that we have in knowledge. And so we had the KAP topic, risk factors, complications or impact, and protective action. And so I'm giving some examples of each of those types of questions. So before asking people questions about the topic of your project or the topic of your knowledge, attitudes, and practices survey, it's important to ask if they're even aware of the topic. So some basic examples of this include, has your community been affected by a disaster in the last 10 years? Or what does climate change mean to you? Because if you launch straight into a whole bunch of questions about climate change, they're not going to really understand your questions unless you've established what climate change means to them. There we go. The next is knowledge about risk factors. So questions about risk factors will help you to determine whether a person really understands what puts them at risk of a certain threat. But in general, when we ask knowledge, attitudes, and practices surveys, we're doing that because we have a project that's identified a certain threat that we want a community to build up their resilience or their strength in protecting themselves against. So do they even have an understanding of what their risk factors are? Some examples of questions about risk factors include, what types of disasters do you think put your community at risk? And I have here select multiple from, and then I just have some examples of disasters: hurricanes, floods, landslides. And you would have to decide, as Alicia was saying before, whether you would read those out to people, which I would advise against for this type of question, or whether you would wait for their responses and just click the ones that they say. The next example is, who is at risk of the negative effects of climate change? And this helps you to identify whether people understand who in particular might be at risk. So not just an understanding of the thing that causes the risk, but who may be affected by the risk. And here it says select multiple from people who live on the coast, farmers, fishermen, etc. So as you can see, these ones are pretty basic, but they build upon each other. So you start with, do they have an understanding of the threat? And then do they know what puts them at risk? The next is knowledge about complications or impact. So when a threat occurs because of a risk, the complications that happen after that, or the impact of that threat, can have different effects on different members of the community, and they will have different understandings of the level of impact. Now, I work in health, and so a lot of the time when we ask these questions, we're asking about what the impact of a certain disease will be. So if you get infected with cholera, what might happen? And they'll say things like you could die or you could get very sick. But you can also apply this to certain things around disasters. And so the example that I've given here is, what are the main ways that hurricanes impact your community? And they can select multiple from the loss of income, loss of property, illness, disease, injury, etc. And if you can see that they understand the effect of a threat, you can think about what might motivate them to take action. So if they can tell you, well, the biggest problem that would happen because of this threat is the loss of income, that might be a motivating factor for them. And the last in the knowledge questions is knowledge about protective actions. So we often assume that people don't engage in a behavior, a protective behavior, because they don't know that they should do it. And in the Red Cross, we make this mistake many times when we give out our risk communication materials. We tell people that, for example, from a health perspective, the best thing to do to avoid a disease is to wash your hands with soap. And we tell them that as if they've never heard that before in their lives. Now, maybe the factor that is actually preventing them from washing their hands with soap is the lack of access to soap. So if we can determine, first of all, do they even know about these protective actions? And then later we'll ask a question about, do they do that action? We can find out if the gap is with the knowledge or if the gap is with the practice and therefore with some other barrier. So the example that I gave here is, what actions can a person take in advance to protect their family from a hurricane? And then I have some examples here so they can talk to their family about what to do, get a radio to listen to updates, keep critical documents in a valuable safe. And again, I wouldn't read these out because a lot of the time, these are all correct answers. So a lot of the time, if you start reading them, people would be, oh yeah, that's right, and you end up clicking everything. But what's important here is when you develop the potential answers to this question, you think about asking this question in the same way when you get to practices. So this is, what actions can a person take? And that's about their knowledge. And later on, when it comes to action, you can ask them, what action did you take or have you taken? So you understand the difference between what they know they should do and what they actually do. I'm going to hand back over to Alicia now. First, I'll mute myself. Thanks, Alicia.
All right. So we're now going to discuss some attitudes-related questions. How do we measure what people believe and the perceptions that people have? So we've divided it into different areas, one of which is risk perception. So people may understand or have the knowledge that a particular risk exists. So there's, a risk of damage to property as a result of a particular hazard or natural disaster, but they may not think that it threatens them. So questions on risk perception help us to understand whether people think that this threat has any particular relevance in their lives and what's the level of threat that they think it has. So for example, one question could be, how likely do you think it is that your community will experience a disaster in the next 12 months? and then you ask them to select from, a scale. In this case, we used very likely, somewhat likely, not likely. Okay. And in terms of attitudes to concerns and beliefs, the things that concern a person most about a risk or threat are also generally most likely to motivate them into taking action. And so understanding their biggest concerns about threats will help to direct you in terms of your communication efforts, and will help you to hone in on addressing those concerns so that we can help to motivate them into action. So for example, one such question related to attitudes and concerns and beliefs could be, compared to a year ago, is your household able or less able to handle a disaster? If yes, why? And you can select for a multiple of responses from amount, loss of income, effects of previous disaster, health reasons. And I wouldn't read these out. I think we both agree we wouldn't read these out. We want persons to spontaneously respond so that we hear directly from them. All right. Okay, in terms of attitudes to action, people's thoughts about the actions that we're trying to promote or discourage can reveal what factors act as impediments or barriers or even promoters of behavior change. So for example, being prepared for a disaster will help my household handle the disaster better. Select from, and again we use the scale, agree, disagree, not sure. Attitudes to stigma and discrimination. So stigma and discrimination can result in impeded access or restricted access or no access to particular services that protect you from threats. So understanding how people perceive other populations will help us to understand the culture in which you're operating and the barriers that need to be broken down, the gaps that need to be filled in, and which populations may need a specific and focused outreach so that they're not missed and overlooked. And also they help to direct education efforts towards those persons who hold kind of discriminatory views of other populations. So for example, please tell me if you agree or disagree with the following statement. A woman is to blame if she is a victim of domestic violence. And again, we use the scale here. Select one from amount, agree, disagree, unsure. Or another question could be, in your community, are there any groups who should be considered less of a priority for accessing shelters? All right, and I'm going to switch over to Erin here, who will discuss the practices, types of questions.
Thanks, Alicia. So before I launch into some examples of practice questions, I just want to remind you about something we discussed in the first week. So when we talk about practices in a KAP survey, we have to understand that we're only getting what people report that they are doing. So it's not you're not observing what they do unless you've structured a survey where you actually go and observe, say, hand washing, but that's quite difficult to do and often quite invasive. You're asking people whether they do something. So there's naturally some bias that can be created with these questions. The other thing I wanted to note is that practices happen when we look at them at many different levels. So people do things to protect themselves as individuals, people do things to protect their families, and people do things to protect their communities. And often one of the strongest comments that we can make as the Red Cross when we finish a KAP survey is differentiating between what people do at an individual level, at a family level, and at a community level. Because the value of what the Red Cross does is that we help people protect their communities. So even though at an individual level, for example, someone may be protecting themselves with mosquito repellent against dengue fever, they may not be doing things at a community level to get rid of the mosquito. So we try and say as the Red Cross, well, people are taking individual actions. So they're motivated to protect themselves against something, but we want to make this community stronger, and we can see that they're not doing community actions. And so as conveners of the community, the Red Cross can take action. So here on this slide, I talk about protective questions, about protecting yourself, your family or your household, and protecting the community. I mentioned in this slide something called the socio-ecological model of behavior change. Do not worry if you're not familiar with it already. It's really just talking about things that happen at an individual level, a household or family level, and then a community level, and beyond that into policy. So the first example that I have here is, what actions do you take to protect you or your family from a hurricane? And this will allow people to answer about ways that they protect themselves as individuals and the ways that they protect their family. And so there's select multiple from talk with your family about what to do. And you'll notice that these are the same answers that we had before on the knowledge question. So we asked them whether they knew what they should do, and now we're asking them, what do you actually do? One thing that I wanted to note about this select multiple from, because I think a lot of you have been in the path of a hurricane before, unfortunately, and know that there are many, many different things and different tips and different answers that we could get from this response. And Alicia talked a little bit about multiple choice questions and the ideal number of responses, so not to make them too broad. So the way that you come up with the answers to this question, the different multiple choice answers, is that you start testing that with people in your office, people in your community, to come up with the best set of answers that will represent the types of answers that you'll get back. The second question I have here is, what actions do you take to address the threat of climate change in your community? And they can select multiple from relocate inland, construct shelters, develop early warning systems, etc., etc. The next section that I have is about participation. So what do they engage in already in their community, or what existing mechanisms are there that we could leverage through our project? Because remember, we're asking these questions so that we can take reasonable actions. We're asking not out of curiosity, but because we want to make the project better. So we can ask them questions like, in the past year, have you or your family member done the following? And then you just list, this is one that you would read out, you list these things and find out whether they have done these things. For example, have they got a first aid certificate? Did they participate in a community meeting about emergency preparedness? Have they participated in an evacuation drill? Another example could be, have you been trained to assist your community in the event of a disaster? And if yes, by whom? And that may give you some clues to who's already active in a community in preparing for a disaster. The last one that I wanted to talk about under practices is about post-impact actions. So after the threat has occurred, after a hurricane, or after someone has experienced gender-based violence, or after someone has become sick, what do they do? How do they seek help, and what methods do they use to cope? So we have some examples here. If you were a survivor of gender-based violence, the first person you would report the incident to is the police, a family member, a friend, a religious leader, etc. Now, of course, this is another one that you wouldn't read the answers out to, and you would have to do training with your volunteers about the appropriate ways to ask this question, as well as emphasizing that if people do not want to answer the question, that's fine, you just move on to the next one. Another example, if you thought you had dengue, what would you do? Select multiple from, and then it has seek health care from a health clinic. So this one is about what we call in public health care-seeking behaviours. So if you get sick, who do you go and see? And often the first people that people go and see are not the people that we think. It's not necessarily going to be the doctor or going to the polyclinic, but it might be seeking the support of a religious leader or telling your mother-in-law. And that's important because they become people that you need to inform and need to make sure they get referred to quality care. And then if you needed help or resources after a disaster, who would you contact? And if people say family or friends and don't have any other thing that they can put there, you know that maybe you need to talk about if this is something that your Red Cross National Society can do, how can you get word out that you are someone that they can contact, or that there is a local government organization that they can contact? And that will help when you form your risk communication materials. So if a hurricane happens, what should I do? So now I think Alicia is moving on with challenges and tips for success. Alicia?
Hi, can you hear me? Me?
I think we can hear you now.
Okay, great. All right, so here are some other tips that we've come up with. One of the challenges I think a lot of people face is whether qualitative questions should be included and how many qualitative questions should be asked. Now, just to recap on what qualitative questions are, they're also known as open-ended questions. They tend to be more exploratory in nature, while quantitative questions are known as closed-ended questions. They're very specific. So, yes, no. You have like very specific kind of closed answers. So it's important to note that although both quantitative and qualitative questions are closed and open can be asked, qualitative answers are actually much more difficult to input and analyze. So we would encourage you to limit your use and inclusion of qualitative questions. Now, one way to circumvent the difficulties of asking qualitative questions, because we do recognize they're important, is to ask the question in a more specific, closed way. What does this mean, though? So instead of how did you feel after the hurricane hit the island and asking the person to provide their own response, maybe you can word it in the following way. Which emotion or emotions did you feel after the hurricane hit the island? And you can come up with a list of emotions. You code those, more on that in the ODK segment of this series. But so you come up with a list of emotions, and then they will tell you which emotions they felt, and you can indicate, list up to 2 or 3 emotions. All right. So you can include things like sad, angry, no feeling, depressed, moody, happy, joyful. I mean, you probably wouldn't feel happy or joyful, but you include those. And another option could be to include or to use a semantic differential scale. So very upset and very, polar opposite, very good. And then you can get what would initially have been a qualitative answer in a more specific quantitative fashion. Now, generally speaking, though, we encourage you to limit your use of qualitative questions or to rephrase them in such a way that they're more specific and more quantitative, because qualitative questions are generally considered to be more suitable for in-depth interviews, key informant interviews, and focus group discussions because of the broad nature of the questions and the responses that you can derive from such questions. All right? So on to the next slide. All right. Okay. Oh boy, every time I press it, we go on to 2. All right, we're on the right slide now. So how do we choose our question options? And what do we mean by question options? How do we choose the kinds of options that we give that are listed after the question? And what are some of the things that we need to consider in coming up with the options? So one consideration is to involve more people in the design and testing process. Involve as many persons as possible from different subject matters, different fields, from subject matter experts to generalists to laypersons, so that your testing can be as comprehensive as possible. Everyone will not view your questions in the same light. Some persons may find a lot of difficulty with the way that you phrased your questions. And I think the broader your testing audience is, I think the better your results will tend to be. So we've encouraged you to test questions with people in your Red Cross National Society, but don't stop there. You can even involve persons who are not part of your Red Cross Society, because they're going to be less familiar, they may be less familiar with the jargon and subject-specific terms and references, and they're going to be more representative of people who you will meet and potential respondents in the survey. So they can also add a lot of value in your testing process. Now, your choice list in terms of your options for questions should be comprehensive, yes, but it shouldn't be so long that it makes it difficult for the respondent to find the right options. And this is worded interestingly, because this really depends on finding the right options. Who's going to be finding the right options? Is it going to be read out, which we don't suggest that you do, or are they going to read through themselves? And if they're reading through themselves, we don't want them to see the responses. But basically, you have to effect a good balance and decide how you are going to conduct your survey, which questions are going to be read out loud, which options are read out loud, and how many options you slot in or include within questions. If you're asking about public awareness or awareness of different media, for example, you can provide as many media, as many radio stations, television stations, social media platforms as exist, and they may range from 30 to 35 or 40. So it's likely to be a very extensive list, but you don't need to read all of those out. You just want to make the data analysis as easy as possible. And so identifying all of those options ahead of time makes your data analysis much easier. All right, and we want to decide also, we touched bases on this before, we addressed it before, but decide whether you want respondents to be able to choose only one or multiple answers. We've already explained that restricting choices to just one answer may not be very logical, because there may be a myriad ways in which persons can respond to things, a myriad of actions that they can take, or multiple things that they know. So you have to decide how many choices persons are able to select. Decide whether you will read out options, again. And also, probe, but do not prompt. What's the difference between these two? You don't want to give people the responses, but if somebody isn't expressing themselves clearly, or you think they're trying to find the right word, it's okay to ask, for example, or to say, if they say, for example, I have heard this on, let me see, the TV. It was a particular channel. Oh dear, it was a channel that I saw this news item on. You don't want to start listing all of the channels, because I think that's akin to prompting. But maybe you can repeat what they've said. Probe. Okay, you saw it on a channel, so that means you saw it on TV then? Okay, so which media did you see or hear this on? And that should help to jog their memory. It's general, but it's not so specific that it gives them the information. And last on this slide, if you make an option for other, consider whether you actually need to capture the free answers given. So on this point, do you then engage in a very exhaustive identification of the possible answers, thereby eliminating the need to capture the free answers? Do you think that the free answers may be so convoluted and so broad that it will involve too much in your data analysis? You need to decide whether this other option is actually necessary. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next slide. And Erin is going to address this issue, which is on subsets and branches, so subset and branch logic.
Thanks. I'm aware of the time, so I'll try and keep it short and sweet. So many of you would have seen in questions the use of subsets or branches. And the example that we have here is, has your household been affected by a natural disaster in 5 years? And if yes, then you go to a different question. Did you have an emergency disaster plan? And if no, you go to another question. Do you currently have an emergency disaster plan? So depending on your answer, you're guided in different directions. And it can sometimes be very useful if used well. So the warning that I have here is that sometimes it's really tempting to use the subsets to find out more about subpopulations. But I would warn against this. So an example of that would be, do you work here? Yes. If you work here, do you do this? If you do this, then why? And it kind of gets deeper and deeper and deeper, but you'll probably get only a couple of people responding to that question. So if you go to general households and ask, are you pregnant? If you're pregnant, do you do this? You don't get a big enough sample size to make a comment on them. And even though you think you're going in depth, you really aren't. So I would suggest, if you want to explore the behaviors or the knowledge of a certain population, that you actually seek to find that population and ask them, either in a focus group discussion or key informant interviews. It will make your data analysis easier, and it will make the survey quite a bit shorter. The next is on bias, which Alicia already talked about in some way. We have an example here of how a phrasing of a question can influence the results. So instead of something like, do you realize that it is irresponsible not to have a disaster emergency plan, which obviously is quite a loaded question, we could say, how important do you think it is to have an emergency plan, and have them rank it, acknowledging that there is still some bias there. But there are many things that you ask people that you think, well, we said that 90% of people, when we asked them, were using condoms. Now, when a stranger comes to my house, hopefully they're not asking me at my front door whether I use condoms, but if they are, I would most likely say the thing that I think will please them the most. And so it's not an accurate way to get information about practices. So consider how your question will cause bias. And the last is on diversity. So we should consider gender and diversity in selecting and writing questions. At the very least in your survey, do ask people whether they're male or female, or whether they would prefer not to say, because you want to be able to disaggregate that data and have an understanding of who's been answering the questions in your survey. But just including questions about diverse and vulnerable groups, and that doesn't mean just women, but I'm talking about groups that are, maybe they have disabilities, or people who are part of the LGBTI community, people who are elderly. This does not mean that you have addressed their issues in a project. So you may want to write in a project report that you've addressed the needs of diverse and vulnerable groups simply by asking questions about them, but that is not how you actually address their needs. So you can ask questions in a KAP that address these groups, but do be wary of subpopulations, as I was just talking about in the subsets and branches slide. But actively reach out to diverse and vulnerable groups. Actively find out those people who are leaders or voices of their community, and try to do more than just use a household survey to find out their opinions or how they may be discriminated against. And so that brings us to the end, where we went over time by a little bit. So we understand if you haven't been able, if you're not able to stay with us, if you do have any questions, feel free to type them to us and we'll answer them, or you can answer them ask them by speaking or email us after. We'll be, as I said, in the chat recording this and sending it out, and if we have issues with the recording, we will make second recordings to send out so that everyone has it. Here are the emails and contact information of myself, Alicia, and Alani, the technical officer at CADRIM, who you can send questions to. And the next KAP webinar will be this week, I believe on the 7th. Will be on many people have been asking about. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much to my co-host, Alicia. It's been fantastic working with you on this presentation. I know that we've had some trouble, and thank you all for being patient. We're still trying to use technology. It's always changing, and as is always the case, we have some delays on different ends. And thank you to the Caribbean Disaster Risk Management Reference Centre, who's helped us put this together, and to everyone who's tuned in today. We'll be sending out a recording of this session. Thank you very much.